World leaders are absolutely furious, and they are beginning a brutal campaign of retaliation against Donald Trump and his disgraceful regime over his threats to invade Greenland. You need to understand exactly what happened behind closed doors over the past weekend. Events the U.S. mainstream media is deliberately ignoring. Senior ambassadors from across the European Union convened an emergency secret meeting in Brussels, and the atmosphere was not one of routine diplomatic concern, but that of a war council. They discussed what they called the economic nuclear option, a last resort move before the outbreak of real military conflict, ominously named the trade bazooka. These are not minor tariffs or symbolic sanctions. This is the most powerful economic coercion tool Europe has ever designed, originally created to counter China's bullying, but now, ironically, aimed squarely at the United States. The trade bazooka would allow the EU to unilaterally freeze the assets of U.S. corporations, strip American tech companies of their intellectual property rights in Europe, and completely cut off access to euro-denominated financial markets. Imagine Apple, Google, or Tesla waking up one morning to find they can no longer sell or operate in the world's wealthiest 450 million person market, an act of outright economic annihilation. The ambassadors agreed that Donald Trump is no longer a partner, but an existential threat, and they concluded that if the U.S. makes any military move toward Greenland, or continues threatening Canada, Europe will pull the trigger, accepting short-term pain to neutralize America's capacity to wage war. This represents a shocking psychological shift. For 70 years, Europe looked to the U.S. for protection, and now it is preparing to cripple the American economy in self-defense. Through blind arrogance, Donald Trump has turned America's closest allies into its most dangerous enemies, and as Europe prepares for this confrontation, it is not acting alone. It is coordinating closely with Canada, forming a transatlantic vice tightening around Washington from both sides of the ocean. While Europe is loading its economic artillery, Donald Trump is lighting another fuse in a powder keg right along America's northern border. He has shifted his obsessive gaze toward Canada with a disturbing fixation. Leaks from inside the West Wing reveal that Trump repeatedly tells close advisors that he wants Canada, not a trade renegotiation, but Canada itself as the 51st state of the United States. Respected journalist Kristen Welker reported yesterday morning that Trump has intensified this focus using dangerously familiar rhetoric, claiming Canada is too vulnerable to U.S. adversaries like Russia or China, and that America therefore needs to do something to secure it. This is the classic language of invasion throughout history, inventing a threat to justify a so-called defensive occupation. Trump views Canada not as a sovereign nation, but as a massive stockpile of resources waiting to be seized: fresh water, oil, minerals, and timber. And he believes overwhelming U.S. military power could force Prime Minister Justin Trudeau or his likely successor Mark Carney into submission. But he has gravely misjudged the resolve of the North. Mark Carney is not intimidated. He has sent a blunt message not through words, but through military action, seriously considering the immediate deployment of additional Canadian forces to Greenland. The symbolism is enormous. Canada is declaring that its defensive frontier is not the U.S.-Canada border, but the Arctic, alongside its European allies. They are drawing a red line in the ice. If U.S. troops set foot in Greenland, they will not face Danes alone. They will face Canadians as well. In trying to turn North America into his personal backyard, Trump is instead forging an anti-U.S. military alignment on the continent itself. His delusions of power are driving the United States into total isolation, surrounded by former friends who now stand armed to defend their sovereignty against Washington's greed. To understand the true scale of Donald Trump's strategic failure, you have to look at what Mark Carney just pulled off in Beijing. While Trump was busy firing off tariff threats on social media, Prime Minister Carney executed a perfect checkmate, completing a state visit to China and returning with a $1 trillion strategic trade deal. Let that number sink in. $1 trillion. This is not a routine agricultural agreement. It is a fundamental restructuring of the global economic order. The deal effectively opens North America's back door to the Chinese economy, shattering years of U.S. efforts to contain Beijing. At the heart of the agreement are electric vehicles. Canada has agreed to allow advanced, low-cost Chinese EVs into its market under preferential tariffs. That is a disaster for the United States, because from Canada, those vehicles will exert crushing competitive pressure on the American auto industry. Detroit, already struggling with high costs and a slow transition, will be squeezed mercilessly. Trump promised to protect U.S. auto workers with tariffs, but Carney just tore down that wall by inviting America's biggest competitor right next door. China has also committed to purchasing massive quantities of Canadian liquefied natural gas and canola oil, making U.S. Midwest farmers and Texas energy companies the biggest losers as they watch the world's largest market slip out of their hands. Trump thought he could bully Canada by threatening to rip up the USMCA, but Canada simply found a new partner, one richer, more willing to spend, and far more patient. Carney's message is ice-cold and unmistakable. If the United States refuses to play fair, Canada will play with someone else, and that someone else happens to be Trump's worst geopolitical nightmare, leaving Canada richer and more secure while the U.S. slowly isolates itself inside its own tariff fortress. The outrage is no longer confined to the halls of power. It is spilling into every street and household across Canada. A quiet but devastating uprising is underway. According to the latest polls, between 73 and 75% of Canadians are now boycotting American products. Think about that. 3/4 of the population of our largest trading partner is refusing to buy our goods. They are not buying Kentucky bourbon, not buying California wine, not buying U.S. processed foods. In supermarkets in Toronto and Vancouver, American products are being left on the shelves like cursed items. This is a collective middle finger from the Canadian public to Donald Trump. They would rather pay more or buy domestic alternatives than send a single dollar to a regime that threatens their sovereignty. Laura Ingraham on Fox News can complain that Canada is trying to destroy the U.S. economy, but she has it backward. American arrogance forced its best customer to turn away. And then there is the staggering hypocrisy at the border. Trump constantly screams about immigrants and drugs pouring in from the South, yet remains silent about what is happening in the North. In the past 48 hours, authorities intercepted a shipment of $7 million worth of heroin. But here is the critical detail. The truck was not going from Canada into the United States. It was going from the United States into Canada. Under Trump, America has become an exporter of hard drugs and weapons to its neighbors. We are sending poison to kill Canadian youth and guns to arm gangs in Toronto. And then Trump has the nerve to call Canada vulnerable and in need of protection. It is absurd. He is the source of that vulnerability. He creates chaos, exports crime, and then uses that very chaos as a pretext to threaten a neighbor's sovereignty. Canadians see this hypocrisy clearly. They know Trump's wall was never about security. It is a monument to racism and catastrophic mismanagement. I want you to pause for a moment and look at a heartbreaking image, one that should haunt the conscience of any American who still has a shred of self-respect. The flag-draped coffins of Danish soldiers killed in Afghanistan in 2007. Ask yourself, who did they die for? They did not die defending Copenhagen. They died defending New York and Washington, D.C. After the 9/11 attacks, the United States became the only nation in history to invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all. And who answered that call most faithfully? Denmark. Per capita, Denmark lost more soldiers in Afghanistan than any other NATO ally. They sent their sons and daughters to die in the desert so Americans could live in safety. Their blood was the price of alliance. And now, in 2026, how does Donald Trump repay that sacrifice? By threatening to invade their homeland. by calling them freeloaders, by threatening a 25% tariff on their economy unless they hand over Greenland at a discount. This is not just a political mistake. It is a moral betrayal of the most grotesque kind. Trump is trampling on the graves of Danish soldiers who died for the United States. He is telling the world that sacrifice for America is meaningless, that loyalty is rewarded with extortion and contempt. When Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen says she is horrified by Trump's behavior, she is not speaking only for her government. She is speaking for families who buried their children. Denmark's anger is justified. When you stab in the back those who once took bullets for you, you are no longer a leader, you are a coward. And under Trump's leadership, America is wearing that cowardly face before the entire world. In Nuuk, the icy capital of Greenland, the usual atmosphere of calm has vanished, replaced by the tension of wartime. Orla Jolson, a local resident, has shared shocking images showing the reality on the ground. After massive protests against Trump, the sound of gunfire now echoes from firing ranges. Danish soldiers who have just arrived on the island are not resting. They are moving straight from the airport to the training grounds, zeroing their weapons in biting cold and blinding snow. This is not a parade or a show of force for cameras. It is preparation for real war. They are training to fight in some of the harshest conditions on Earth, to defend every inch of Greenland. And the assumed enemy in these live-fire drills is not Russia or China, but the United States Marine Corps. A tragic reversal that underscores how far this crisis has gone. At the same time, an unprecedented exercise called Arctic Endurance is underway, bringing together troops not only from Denmark, but also Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. 8 of NATO's most powerful nations are standing shoulder to shoulder on Greenland, issuing a joint statement reaffirming their commitment to strengthening Arctic security as a shared transatlantic interest. While the diplomatic language insists the exercise threatens no one, the underlying message is unmistakable. Do not test us. NATO is drawing a red line on the ice, warning Trump that any attack on Greenland would be treated as an attack on Europe itself, as soldiers from across the continent form a living wall to contain the recklessness of a U.S. president, marking a stunning inversion of the world order in which NATO must now mobilize to defend itself from the leader of its own alliance. The rot of the Trump administration does not stop at public threats. It seeps into the shadows of the intelligence world through acts of deep disgrace. The Danish government has just leaked a shocking internal report from its Ministry of Defense, revealing that senior U.S. military officials, acting under direction from the White House, attempted to conduct espionage operations on Allied soil. They tried to lure, pressure, and bribe Danish and Greenlandic officials into handing over classified information, detailed layouts of military bases, deep water ports, and strategic airfields, with an objective that is painfully clear: gathering data to plan a military invasion. Danish security experts were forced to issue an official warning to their personnel to be on guard against American espionage. Consider the humiliation of this reality. We are not spying on enemies, we are spying on friends, behaving like a hostile power from inside NATO itself. Denmark's Berlingske newspaper published the revelations, igniting outrage across Europe. But it goes even further. In Ukraine, the betrayal cuts deeper still. France and Ukraine had long suspected that Trump was passing intelligence to Vladimir Putin, so they set an elaborate trap known as the Canary Trap, feeding the U.S. administration falsified but highly convincing intelligence about the Ukrainian battlefield, and then monitoring Russian channels. As predicted, the fake intelligence surfaced inside Russian command structures, proving that the Trump administration had taken information from allies and handed it directly to the enemy, believing it was helping Moscow. France and Ukraine outplayed them, but in doing so exposed the profoundly treacherous nature of this regime. Trump is not merely abandoning allies. He is actively working for the opposing side to undermine Western security. The peak of this unrestrained greed is Trump's latest initiative called the so-called Board of Peace. The name sounds lofty, like a humanitarian effort to resolve conflicts in Gaza or Ukraine, but the moment you read the membership terms, it becomes clear this is a blatant scam. Trump is demanding that any country seeking permanent membership on this council pay an entry fee, and that fee is $1 billion. And where does that $1 billion go? Not to the United Nations, not to the U.S. State Department. It must be transferred into a fund controlled by Trump himself, with the money once again tracing back to accounts in Qatar. He is literally selling seats in a fake diplomatic body the same way people sell memberships to an exclusive golf club. This brazenness has shocked the world. Even Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister and a leader known for trying to stay in Trump's good graces, reportedly refused to participate. When someone like Netanyahu deems the terms unacceptable, you know every line of reason has been crossed. Trump is attempting to profit from the blood and suffering of civilians in Gaza, turning humanitarian catastrophe into a personal fundraising scheme. Last week at the United Nations, the U.S. ambassador tried to rally Arab nations against Iran, only to be flatly rejected by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and even Qatar itself, who essentially told Washington that it no longer has the moral authority or military credibility to lead anyone. They see U.S. forces bogged down protecting shady oil deals in Venezuela, and they understand that American policy under Trump is priced in dollars, not principles. The Board of Peace may already be dead, but it will live on as a lasting monument to the greed and corruption of Donald Trump. But ladies and gentlemen, the price of Donald Trump's greed and arrogance does not stop at dirty money sitting in Qatari bank accounts. It is driving something far more catastrophic, an existential disaster for American power itself, the collapse of the U.S. dollar, and an unprecedented, humiliating diplomatic isolation. Look at what just happened at the United Nations headquarters in New York last week, an event the mainstream media deliberately glossed over because it was too painful to confront. The U.S. ambassador, acting under Trump's orders, tried to rally the international community to condemn and punish Iran. In the past, when America spoke, the world listened. When America pointed, allies lined up. This time, silence filled the General Assembly Hall, and that silence was a scream. No one stood up. No one followed. America stood alone, exposed, and weak. Even traditional Middle Eastern partners like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and, ironically, Qatar itself, the same country holding Trump's money, said no. They sent a cold message to Washington. You no longer have the moral authority to lead, and you no longer have the military credibility to enforce your threats. They know where the U.S. military really is. Carrier strike groups are not in the Persian Gulf protecting global security. They are parked off the coast of Venezuela, guarding the oil shipments of Delcy Rodriguez. The world sees that the U.S. military has been degraded from a global peacekeeping force into a private mercenary army, serving the financial interests of the president's family. When you turn the military into a money laundering tool, you lose respect. And when you lose respect, you lose power. Iran knows it, Russia knows it, China knows it. That is why they no longer fear Trump's threats. He is a paper tiger roaring on social media while his claws are worn down by corruption. The economic consequence of this isolation is a doomsday scenario for the U.S. economy: de-dollarization. For 80 years, America's greatest privilege has been the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, allowing us to print money to finance massive debt, sustain a high standard of living without equivalent production, and export inflation abroad. Trump has weaponized the dollar so recklessly that it has become a toxic risk to anyone holding it. By threatening to freeze European assets, slap tariffs on Canada, and punish anyone who does not kneel, the world has realized that holding U.S. dollars is like holding a ticking bomb. Europe's trade bazooka is not just about stopping purchases of American goods, it is about stopping purchases of American debt. Central banks around the world are quietly dumping U.S. Treasury bonds and moving into gold, euros, and even the yuan. If Europe and China simultaneously unload the trillions of dollars in U.S. debt they hold, our financial markets could collapse in a single morning. Interest rates would not sit at 5 or 7%. They would explode to 15 or 20% to attract buyers. That means your mortgage triples, your credit cards become predatory, small businesses collapse because they cannot borrow, and the U.S. government can no longer pay Social Security or Medicare because tax revenue only covers interest on the debt. Trump thinks he is playing a clever poker game by extorting the world, but in reality, he is sawing off the leg of the chair the entire U.S. economy is sitting on. Canada's deal with China is not just about selling electric vehicles. It is about building a new payment system independent of the U.S.-controlled SWIFT network. When Canada, Europe, and the BRICS bloc create a parallel financial system, the dollar will revert to its true value. Paper printed with dead presidents by a government bankrupt in credibility. We are witnessing the end of American financial exceptionalism. The United States will become an ordinary country, struggling with inflation, shortages, and isolation, just like the nations Trump mocks as weak. The humiliation at the United Nations was only the overture. The real catastrophe arrives when the world sends trillions of dollars in paper back to Washington, and when that happens, no border wall and no lie on social media will stop the tsunami of impoverishment crashing into the American middle class. This is the true legacy of MAGA, making America poorer and alone again. Look at the economic numbers to see the complete failure of the America First doctrine. Donald Trump launched a trade war with the stated goal of containing China and elevating the U.S. economy to absolute dominance. But the reality in 2025 tells a very different story. China's GDP is still growing at around 5%. Its economy has not collapsed as Trump promised, and instead it has adapted and expanded by successfully diversifying its trading partners, doing booming business with Europe, South America, Africa, and now Canada through a $1 trillion deal. The rest of the world continues to trade, connect, and grow without asking Washington for permission, while the United States is turning itself into an isolated island in the middle of the global trading system. Trump's tariffs have not protected domestic manufacturing. They have raised costs for American consumers and made U.S. goods less competitive, even driving away right-wing European leaders once seen as ideological allies, such as Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who has openly criticized Trump's recklessness over Greenland. When you lose support even from those on your own side, you are standing alone on the edge of a cliff. America is isolated in confronting Iran, isolated in its trade war with China, and worst of all, actively turning itself into an adversary of its own NATO alliance, while the U.S. dollar slowly loses its dominant position as countries seek alternative payment systems to escape Trump's economic coercion. This isolation is not strength. It is a slow, self-inflicted economic suicide. Ladies and gentlemen, we have taken a long journey to expose the darkest truths of this era, from Europe's so-called trade bazooka to the betrayed coffins of Danish soldiers, from Canada's $1 trillion deal to the disgraceful espionage network in Greenland, from dirty money flows through Qatar to the collapse of America's standing on the world stage. All of these pieces come together to form a chilling picture. The exposed state. A government laid bare in its greed, deception, and incompetence. Donald Trump and his regime are gambling this country's future, wagering the lives of soldiers and the prosperity of ordinary people on reckless schemes designed to serve nothing but their own egos and bank accounts. But within that exposure, there is also hope. The world has awakened, Canada has awakened, Europe has awakened, and most importantly, the American people are beginning to awaken. We see resistance in the ballot box, in the streets, and in the growing refusal to accept comforting lies. Do not let fear paralyze you. Use truth as your weapon. Share this information with your family, your friends, and your neighbors, because only when we recognize that the enemy is not just abroad, but sitting in the White House, can we begin the work of reclaiming our country. We need an America that does not bully its allies, does not export drugs to its neighbors, and does not launder money through authoritarian regimes. We need an America worthy of the sacrifice made by Danish soldiers years ago. This fight is far from over, but we will not back down. Subscribe to the channel, hold on to your belief, and thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.